Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change lives in ways we never expect. When NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal gave up his first-class seat to an elderly Vietnam veteran one busy afternoon, he thought he was just doing the right thing. He had no idea he was about to unlock a 50-year-old mystery that would change multiple lives forever. The Atlanta airport was packed that Wednesday afternoon. Gate B7 looked like it might burst, with people sitting on the floor and leaning against walls. Flight 2847 was overbooked, and nobody was happy about it. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we simply don't have any more seats in first class," a tired gate agent named Monica said to an angry passenger. Her voice was getting scratchy after saying the same thing for the past hour. That's when he walked in. Even in a baseball cap and simple black t-shirt, Shaquille O'Neal was impossible to miss. At 7 feet 1 inch tall, he towered over everyone at the gate. A few kids pointed and whispered, but most of the adults were too busy checking their phones or arguing about seats to notice the basketball legend in their midst. Shaq kept his head down, trying not to draw attention. He'd gotten good at that over the years, even though it never really worked. But today, his attention wasn't on the people staring at him. It was on the elderly man standing at the counter, his hands shaking as he held out his boarding pass. 32, man wore a faded Vietnam veteran hat covered in pins, and his weathered hands trembled slightly as he spoke to Monica. His khaki pants were neatly pressed, and his blue button-down shirt had clearly been ironed, but worry lines creased his forehead. "No, wait. Understand my connection was late, but I have to get to Atlanta today," the man said, his voice quiet but urgent. "Isn't there anything you can do?" Monica typed frantically on her computer. "Mr. Henderson, I can get you on the flight, but it's going to be a middle seat near the back. It's literally all we have left." James Henderson, as his boarding pass showed, gripped his small carry-on bag tighter. "I see," he said, trying to hide his disappointment. "Well, I suppose that will have to do." Shaq watched as Mr. Henderson walked away from the counter, moving slowly toward one of the few empty seats by the window. The old veteran winced as he lowered himself into the chair, and Shaq noticed he was favoring his left leg. A young boy tugged on Shaq's sleeve. "Are you really Shaquille O'Neal?" Shaq smiled down at the kid. "Sure am, little man. What's your name?" "Tommy. I play basketball at school. I'm the tallest kid in my class." Tommy's mother appeared, apologizing for the interruption, but Shaq waved it off with a friendly grin. "No problem at all. Tommy here was just telling me about his basketball skills." As he chatted with Tommy, Shaq kept glancing over at Mr. Henderson. The veteran had pulled something from his wallet. A photograph, worn and creased at the edges. Whatever was in that photo made Mr. Henderson's eyes go misty. The gate area got more crowded as flight time approached. A businessman in an expensive suit complained loudly about the boarding process. A mother tried to calm crying twins. Through it all, Mr. Henderson sat quietly, staring at his photo. Shaq excused himself from Tommy and walked toward the veteran. He'd almost reached him when the gate agent's voice crackled over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to begin. Boarding Flight 2847 to Atlanta. Please have your boarding passes ready. We'll start with our active-duty military personnel and passengers needing special assistance." Mr. Henderson struggled to his feet, grabbing his bag. As he did, the photo slipped from his fingers, floating to the floor like a leaf. Shaq bent down to pick it up, but a rush of passengers hurried past, forcing him to step back. The veteran hadn't noticed the fallen photo. He was already shuffling toward the boarding line, his limp more pronounced after sitting for so long. "Sir!" Shaq called out. "Mr. Henderson!" But his voice was lost in the noise of the crowd. The gate agent was speaking again. now boarding first-class passengers and Diamond Elite members. Shaq looked down at his own first-class boarding pass, then at Mr. Henderson's retreating back. The photo lay face down on the carpet, just out of reach as passengers streamed between them. A memory flashed through Shaq's mind, something his father had told him long ago about respect, about duty, about doing the right thing even when nobody was watching. He took a step forward, but another wave of passengers cut him off. "Last call for first-class boarding," Monica announced. Shaq had to make a decision. Fast. He looked at his comfortable first-class seat assignment, then at Mr. Henderson, who was now at the back of the long boarding line. The veteran's shoulders were hunched, his hand gripping the back of a nearby chair for support as he waited. The photograph was still on the floor, and now Shaq could almost reach it. But as his fingers stretched toward it, a gust from the air conditioning sent it skittering under a row of seats. "Now, boarding zone 1, Monica called out. Shaq straightened up, made his choice, and started walking. He didn't know it yet, but that simple decision was about to set in motion a chain of events that would change multiple lives forever. Behind him, just visible under the seat, the corner of the photograph peeked out, and if anyone had been looking closely, they might have noticed something remarkable about the young soldiers in that faded picture. Something that would explain everything that was about to happen. But for now, it remained hidden, as Shaq took his first step toward Mr. Henderson, and toward a story much bigger than a simple seat exchange. "Excuse me, Mr. Henderson?" Shaq's deep voice carried over the crowd noise. The veteran turned around slowly, his eyes traveling up, up, until they met Shaq's. "Yes?" "I couldn't help but notice you're having trouble with your seat assignment," Shaq said, holding out his boarding pass. "I'd like to switch with you." Mr. Henderson's eyes widened as he realized what was being offered. "But you're in first class." "And you served our country," Shaq replied. "My father was in the military too." At the mention of military service, something flickered in Mr. Henderson's eyes. He studied Shaq's face more closely now, as if searching for something familiar. "Your father was in the service?" Mr. Henderson asked quietly. Before Shaq could answer, the gate agent's voice cut through their conversation. "Final boarding call for Flight 2847 to Atlanta." "Please," Shaq said, already reaching for Mr. Henderson's boarding pass. "I insist." A memory washed over Shaq as they exchanged tickets. A summer evening years ago, sitting on the front porch with his father, Philip Harrison. His dad had just returned from duty, still in his Army uniform. "Remember, son," his father had said, "the measure of a man isn't in how tall he stands, but in how he uses that height to lift others up." Back in the present, passengers squeezed past them in the jetway, some doing double takes at the sight of the basketball star. A young woman pulled out her phone, snapping a quick photo. Mr. Henderson was still protesting weakly. "It's too much. I can't accept." "Already done," Shaq said with a smile, pointing at their swapped boarding passes. "You're up front in 2A now. I've got your seat in 28B. They made their way down the aisle of the plane, other passengers pressing themselves against their seats to let Shaq pass. At row 2, he stopped and gestured for Mr. Henderson to take his new seat. The veteran paused, then reached out and gripped Shaq's hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your father raised you right." Something about the way he said it made Shaq pause. But more passengers were coming down the aisle, and he still had to make his way to the back. Moving through the plane was like threading a needle for someone Shaq's size. He bumped his head twice on the overhead bins, earning sympathetic winces from nearby passengers. "Mommy, look how big he is!" a little girl whispered loudly as he passed. "Honey, don't stare," her mother scolded, then smiled apologetically at Shaq. Finally reaching row 28, Shaq found himself sandwiched between a teenage boy wearing headphones and a businessman typing furiously on his laptop. His knees pressed against the seat in front of him, and his shoulders spilled over into his seatmate's space. The teenager pulled off his headphones. "No way! You're Shaq! Wait till my friends hear about this!" The businessman looked up from his laptop, annoyed at first, then surprised. "I saw what you did up there," he said, closing his computer. "That was something special." Shaq just shrugged. Seemed like the right thing to do. As the plane began to push back from the gate, flight attendants started their safety demonstration. But there was a buzz of whispered conversations throughout the cabin as word spread about what had happened. Up in first class, Mr. Henderson settled into his spacious seat, carefully placing his carry-on bag in the overhead bin. As he sat down, he reached for his wallet and froze. The photo was gone. His weathered hands searched every pocket, growing more frantic by the second. A flight attendant noticed his distress. "Sir, is everything all right?" Mr. Henderson looked up, his face pale. "A photograph. I had a photograph." "We can look for it after takeoff," she assured him. "For now, please fasten your seatbelt. We're about to depart." Back in row 28, Shaq shifted uncomfortably in his tight seat. A mother with a crying baby walked past, heading for the bathroom. Without thinking, Shaq reached out and made a funny ED face at the baby, who immediately stopped crying and giggled. "You're good with kids," the businessman commented. "Kids are easy," Shaq replied. "They don't care who you are or how famous you might be. They just respond to kindness." The plane lifted off the ground, leaving the gate and the mysterious photograph behind. As they climbed through the clouds, nobody on board knew that this flight would become more than just another trip to Atlanta. Nobody knew that somewhere in the airport, a cleaning crew would soon find a worn photograph under a seat at gate B7. And nobody, not even Shaq, knew that his simple act of kindness was about to unlock a story that had been waiting 50 years to be told. At 30,000 feet, stories spread fast. By the time the drink cart reached row 15, most passengers knew about the basketball star who had given up his first-class seat to a veteran. Phones lit up across the cabin as people shared the story on social media. "Did you get a picture?" a woman whispered to her seatmate. "My son's never going to believe this." In first class, James Henderson stared out the window, but he wasn't seeing the clouds below. His mind was 50 years away, in a different time, in a different war. The missing photograph had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. A flight attendant named Sarah noticed his untouched ginger ale. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked softly. Mr. Henderson turned from the window. "That photograph?" he started, then shook his head. "It was the only copy I had." Sarah sat down in the empty flight attendant jump seat across from him. "Can you tell me about it? Maybe we can help find it." "It was taken in Vietnam, 1968, Mr. Henderson said, his voice distant. "4 of us, standing in front of a helicopter. Me, Tommy Martinez, Bill Chen, and—" He stopped suddenly, as if catching himself. "And who?" Sarah prompted gently. But Mr. Henderson just shook his head and turned back to the window. Meanwhile, in row 28, Shaq had become an impromptu entertainment center for the kids in nearby rows. He was teaching them a hand-clapping game he'd learned from his own children. "My, Daddy says you're the best basketball player ever," a little girl in a pink dress announced. Shaq laughed. "Your daddy's very kind, but I know some players who might disagree. Michael Jordan, for one." The businessman next to Shaq had introduced himself as David Chen. He'd stopped working on his laptop and was watching the interaction with amusement. "You know," David said, "my father was in Vietnam too. He always told me stories about his unit. They called themselves the Helicopter Heroes because—" He was interrupted by the overhead speaker crackling to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a unique situation. Is there a Mr. James Henderson on board?" In first class, Mr. Henderson's head snapped up. "Mr. Henderson, we've received an urgent message for you from Atlanta General Hospital. If you could please identify yourself to a flight attendant." The cabin buzzed with whispers. Sarah was already moving toward the cockpit with quick, purposeful steps. Back in row 28, Shaq noticed David Chen had gone very still, staring at something on his phone. The businessman's face had drained of color. "Everything okay?" Shaq asked. "That name," David whispered. "Henderson and Atlanta General. It can't be." Before he could explain, another announcement came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." The plane shuddered slightly. A child started crying somewhere in the back. But Shaq barely noticed. He was watching David Chen, who was frantically scrolling through his phone. "My father," David said, more to himself than to Shaq. "He's been in Atlanta General for 3 days, but he always said James Henderson died in the war. He was sure of it." He saw the plane dropped suddenly, causing several passengers to gasp. Drinks rattled on tray tables. Above them, the fasten seatbelt signs dinged on. In first class, Mr. Henderson was talking urgently with Sarah, his face a mask of worry. She nodded several times, then hurried to the cockpit again. A young woman 2 rows ahead of Shaq had been taking pictures of him with the kids. Now she was posting them online, adding the story of the seat exchange. Within minutes, the posts started going viral. Each Shaq official just gave up his first-class seat to a Vietnam vet. Respect the Nichuan heroes. Real-time kindness at 30,000 feet. This is why we love. I'm Shaq. Anyone know the veteran's name? This story is getting bigger by the minute. But none of them knew the real story yet. None of them understood what was really happening. Sarah emerged from the cockpit again, making her way directly to Mr. Henderson. She leaned down and whispered something in his ear. The old veteran's hands gripped his armrests so tight his knuckles turned white. "How long?" he asked, his voice carrying in the quiet cabin. "We land in 45 minutes, Sarah replied. Mr. Henderson closed his eyes. "It might be too late," said Drew. Row 28, David Chen was showing something to Shaq on his phone, an old military photograph, similar to the one that had been lost at the gate. But this one was different. This one explained everything. Just then, the plane banked sharply to the right. The captain's voice came over the speaker again. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we've been given priority landing clearance in Atlanta. Please prepare for an expedited descent." Shaq looked from David's phone to the back of Mr. Henderson's head in first class, and suddenly he understood. The lost photograph, the urgent message, David Chen's father in the hospital, and his own father's military service. They were all connected in a way that seemed impossible. The plane descended through clouds turned golden by the setting sun. Below them, Atlanta's skyline came into view. In less than an hour, a 50-year-old mystery would finally be solved. But first, they had to land, and they had to hurry. The landing gear touched down with a screech of rubber on concrete. As soon as the plane's wheels hit the runway at Atlanta International Airport, Mr. Henderson unbuckled his seatbelt, his hands trembling. "Sir, please remain seated until we reach the gate," Sarah reminded him gently. But there was something in the old veteran's eyes that made her step back. A mix of fear and hope that spoke of decades of waiting. The plane taxied faster than usual, clearance having been given for priority handling. In row 28, Shaq watched as David Chen showed him more photos on his phone, each one filling in pieces of a puzzle that seemed almost too incredible to be true. "My father never got over it," David explained quietly. The guilt of surviving when his friends didn't. At least, that's what he thought happened that day. The plane hadn't even reached the gate when Mr. Henderson was on his feet, pulling his small carry-on from the overhead bin. Sarah didn't try to stop him this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated until we've come to a complete stop," the captain announced, but his voice carried an unusual note of urgency. As the plane approached the gate, Shaq could see several airport staff waiting on the jetway, along with what looked like medical personnel. Something big was happening. The second the aircraft door opened, Mr. Henderson was moving. He pushed past other first-class passengers with a strength that belied his age, almost running down the jetway. "Wait!" Shaq called out, struggling to get up from his cramped seat. "Mr. Henderson, the photograph." But the veteran was already gone. David Chen grabbed his briefcase. "We need to follow him. My father." If it's really him, passengers were standing in the aisle now, many of them filming with their phones as Shaq tried to make his way forward. His height made it impossible to move quickly through the crowded cabin. "Coming through," he said apologetically, bumping, his head yet again on the overhead bins. "Please, it's important." At the front of the plane, Sarah handed him something. "We found this under a seat at the gate." They radioed it ahead. It was the lost photograph. Shaq stared at the faded image, then at David Chen, then back at the photo. "No way," he whispered. Together, they hurried down the jetway and into the terminal. Mr. Henderson was already far ahead, following an airport staff member who was leading him toward ground transportation. "There," David pointed. "They're heading for the emergency medical transport area." They jogged through the terminal, drawing stares from travelers. It wasn't every day you saw Shaquille O'Neal running through an airport with a businessman and a worn photograph. When they reached the exit, they found Mr. Henderson arguing with a transport coordinator. "I don't care about paperwork," the veteran was saying, his voice cracking. "I have to get to Atlanta General right now." "Sir, I understand, but—" "He can ride with me," Shaq interrupted, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling my driver now." Mr. Henderson turned, surprised to see Shaq and David behind him, his eyes fixed on the photograph in Shaq's hand. "Where did you—" he started to ask, but his voice failed. "Mr. Henderson," David said, stepping forward, "my name is David Chen. Bill Chen is my father." The old veteran staggered slightly. Shaq reached out to steady him. "Bill," Mr. Henderson whispered, "but they told us. They said no one survived the crash." "He did," David said softly. "And he's been asking for you, for all of you. The doctors say he started talking about that day when he came out of the coma this morning." Outside, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. Shaq's driver jumped out, opening the doors. "Get in," Shaq said. "All of you. We'll sort everything out on the way." As they settled into the vehicle, Mr. Henderson finally looked at the photograph Shaq was holding. His hands shook as he took it. 50 years, he said, touching the faces in the picture. 50 years we thought we'd lost him. And all this time. The SUV pulled away from the curb, lights flashing as it headed toward Atlanta General Hospital. Behind them, passengers from Flight 2847 were posting their final videos and photos of the scene. But none of them knew what the photograph showed. None of them knew why a simple seat exchange had turned into a race against time. And none of them knew that the biggest surprise was still to come. As the SUV raced through Atlanta traffic, James Henderson's mind drifted back to another time, another place. The humid air of Vietnam in 1968, the sound of helicopter blades cutting through the morning mist. "Henderson, get your rear in gear," Sergeant Bill Chen called out, checking his rifle for the 100th time. "Charlie's not going to wait all day." Young James Henderson, just 22 years old then, grabbed his medical kit and ran toward the waiting helicopter. As a combat medic, he knew every second could mean the difference between life and death. 4 of them were headed out that morning. James Henderson, the medic, Bill Chen, the sergeant, Tommy Martinez, the pilot, and Philip Harrison, their radio operator. They'd been together 6 months, but it felt like years. "Bet you $50 we're back in time for dinner," Tommy said, his usual grin lighting up his face as he started the helicopter's engine. "You're on," Philip replied, adjusting his radio gear. At just 19, he was the youngest of their group, but he'd already earned their trust a dozen times over. None of them knew it would be their last mission together. The SUV hit a pothole, jolting Mr. Henderson back to the present. Shaq was on his phone, talking quietly but urgently. "Yes, we're about 10 minutes out," he was saying. "Can you make sure?" "Yes, that's right, thank you." David Chen was staring at the photograph his father had kept all these years. "Dad never told me the whole story," he said. "Just that something went wrong. That people died because of him." Mr. Henderson shook his head. "Your father was a hero that day. We all were. And we all paid a price." The mission had started routinely enough. A downed aircraft needed covering fire while the rescue team went in. Standard procedure. But nothing in Vietnam stayed routine for long. "Taking fire!" Tommy shouted from the cockpit. 3 o'clock! Sergeant Chen barked orders while Philip radioed for backup. James readied his medical supplies, knowing they'd be needed soon. That's when the first rocket hit. The helicopter spun wildly. Tommy fought the controls while smoke filled the cabin. Through the chaos, James saw Philip Harrison grab the radio with one hand and his rifle with the other. "I'll give you cover!" Philip shouted. "Get them out!" The second rocket came straight at them. "Mr. Henderson?" Shaq's voice was gentle. "We're almost there." The old veteran blinked, pulling himself back from the memory. Atlanta's streets had given way to hospital signs. When Bill A. fell into the coma last week, David explained, he started talking about that day. The doctors said sometimes trauma patients remember things differently when they wake up. That's why he's been asking for you all. Mr. Henderson's hands tightened on his cane. 50 years of thinking they were gone. 50 years of survivor's guilt. And now. The explosion had thrown James clear of the helicopter. Through a haze of pain and smoke, he'd seen Philip Harrison pushing Sergeant Chen out the door just before the fuel tank ignited. Tommy Martinez, their always smiling pilot, never had a chance. The jungle below was a maze of enemy fire and shadows. James had crawled toward what he thought was safety, his medical kit still somehow strapped to his back. The last thing he remembered was seeing the helicopter disappear into the canopy, a ball of fire and metal. Then darkness took him. When he woke up 3 days later in a field hospital, they told him no one else had survived. Not Bill Chen, not Philip Harrison, not Tommy Martinez. They gave him a Purple Heart and sent him home to carry the weight of being the only survivor. The SUV pulled up to the hospital's emergency entrance. An orderly was already waiting with a wheelchair, but Mr. Henderson waved it away. "I've carried this story for 50 years, he said, standing straighter than he had all day. "I can walk a few more steps to finish it." They followed signs for the ICU, each lost in their own thoughts. Shaq found himself thinking about his father, wondering if he'd known more about that day than he'd ever shared. The elevator seemed to take forever. When it finally opened on the 6th floor, They found a nurse waiting for them. "Mr. Chen has been asking for you," she said, leading them down a quiet hallway. "He's weak, but lucid. When he heard you were coming." She paused, smiling. "Well, let's just say we haven't seen him this alert since he woke up." Outside room 642, Mr. Henderson stopped. His hand trembled as he reached for the door. "James?" a weak voice called from inside. "James Henderson, is that really you?" The years fell away as Mr. Henderson stepped into the room. There, in the hospital bed, was his old sergeant. Bill Chen's hair had gone white, his face lined with age, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Bill," James whispered, "they told us. They said no one." "I know," Bill Chen said, tears rolling down his cheeks. "I thought the same about you. All these years." David Chen stood beside his father's bed, watching as 50 years of grief began to heal. But Shaq noticed something else. A familiar look in Bill Chen's eyes as he glanced toward the door. "There's more," Bill said quietly. "That's why I've been trying to reach you. James, there's something you need to know about Philip Harrison that day. Something I've carried all these years." Mr. Henderson sat down heavily in the chair beside the bed. "Philip? But he is right here," a new voice said from the doorway. That's when everything changed. Everyone in room 642 turned toward the doorway. There stood an elderly man in a wheelchair, pushed by a nurse. His military bearing was still evident, despite his age and the oxygen tube in his nose. Shaq felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "Daddy," he whispered. Philip Harrison, Shaq's father, and the man everyone thought had died in Vietnam, smiled weakly. "Hello, son. I see you've met my old friend James." Mr. Henderson grabbed the edge of Bill Chen's bed for support. "Philip? But how?" "That's what I've been trying to tell you," Bill Chen said from his hospital bed. "Philip survived that day too. We both did. But by the time we found each other, we'd been told you were dead, James. And after what Philip did to save us, well, some things got complicated." The nurse wheeled Philip Harrison into the room, positioning him next to Bill's bed. Shaq stood frozen, looking between his father and the two veterans who had been part of his unit. "Son," Philip said, reaching for Shaq's hand, "remember all those stories I told you about respect? About doing the right thing even when nobody's watching? They came from that day in Vietnam, from what I learned from James Henderson." Mr. Henderson shook his head in disbelief. "But I didn't do anything. You're the one who pushed Bill out of the helicopter. You're the one who—" "You taught me how to be brave," Philip interrupted, "every day before that mission, watching you save lives under fire. A 19-year-old kid like me needed that example." David Chen, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward. "That's why Dad's been asking for both of you since he woke up. When he saw Shaq on TV last week, he recognized something in his face. Something that reminded him of that young radio operator from 50 years ago." "But why didn't you tell me?" Shaq asked his father. "All these years?" Philip Harrison's eyes grew distant. "Some wounds are too deep to talk about, son. Some debts too big to explain. When I saw James's name on the casualty list, well, I thought I'd failed him. Failed them all. The Army got it wrong," Bill Chen explained. "In the chaos after the crash, they mixed up the bodies. Another unit had gone down the same day. By the time Philip and I made it back to base, everyone thought we were dead, and James was listed as the only survivor. And then they separated us," Philip continued. "Different hospitals, different paths home. By the time I could search for Bill, years had passed. And James?" His voice broke. James, I'm so sorry. Mr. Henderson stood up slowly, his legs shaking. He took 3 steps and reached for Philip's hand. You saved Bill's life that day. You were just a kid, but you never hesitated. That's why I've been trying to reach you both, Bill said urgently. When I saw Shaq on TV, everything came flooding back. The doctors say this might be my last chance to make things right, to tell the true story. Shaq looked at the photograph. He still held the one that had started all of this. 4 young men standing proud in front of a helicopter, no idea what fate had in store for them. But how did you know I'd be on that flight today? Mr. Henderson asked. Bill Chen smiled weakly. I didn't. Some things are just meant to be. When they told me you were coming, that Shaq had given up his seat for you, I knew it was time. The Hebrew universe has a way of bringing people together, Philip Harrison said, squeezing his son's hand, even if it takes 50 years. A nurse appeared in the doorway. I'm sorry, but Mr. Chen needs to rest now. Wait, Bill called out. The letter. Philip, show them the letter. Philip Harrison reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age. I wrote this the day after the crash, he said. When I thought James was dead, I promised myself I'd give it to his family someday. But then, Mr. Henderson took the envelope with trembling hands. The name on the front was faded, but clear. To the family of James Henderson. A debt I can never repay. Read it, Philip urged. Please. As Mr. Henderson opened the letter, Shaq realized something extraordinary. His simple act of kindness, giving up his seat on the plane, hadn't just helped a veteran. It had completed a circle that began before he was born. But as Mr. Henderson started to read the letter aloud, no one in the room was prepared for what it would reveal. Mr. Henderson's hands trembled as he unfolded the aged paper. The hospital room fell silent except for the steady beeping of Bill Chen's heart monitor. Dear Henderson family, he began reading, his voice thick with emotion. Your son saved my life twice before he died. The first time was 3 months ago, when he pulled me out of enemy fire. The second time was yesterday, when he taught me what true courage means. Philip Harrison closed his eyes as his words from 50 years ago filled the room. The mission went wrong. We were hit. As the helicopter went down, I watched James throw himself between Sergeant Chen and the explosion. In that moment, I understood what he'd been teaching me all along. That sometimes being brave means putting others first, no matter the cost. Shaq placed a hand on his father's shoulder as Mr. Henderson continued reading. I thought I was just a radio operator, too young to make a difference. But James showed me that heroes don't wait for permission. They act. So when the second rocket hit, I did what he would have done. I pushed our sergeant to safety. Bill Chen reached for his son David's hand, tears streaming down his face. I'm writing this letter from a field hospital. They tell me James didn't make it, that I'll receive a medal for saving Sergeant Chen. But the medal belongs to James. Everything I did, I learned from him. I promised to live my life the way he lived his, putting others first, staying brave, doing what's right, even when no one is watching. Mr. Henderson's voice cracked as he read the next lines. I have a son on the way. My wife's letters tell me he's going to be big, maybe even a giant. I promised to teach him everything James taught me. About courage, about kindness, about lifting others up. Shaq felt tears welling in his own eyes as the pieces fell into place. Every lesson his father had taught him, every story about doing the right thing, they had all started here, with James Henderson. I don't know how to live with the weight of surviving when James didn't, but I promise his sacrifice won't be forgotten. His spirit will live on in my son, and in every life I touch from here on out. The letter was signed simply, "Forever grateful, Philip Harrison, radio operator, James Henderson's last student." For a long moment, no one spoke. The weight of 50 years hung in the air between them. Finally, Mr. Henderson looked up from the letter. "But I didn't die," he said softly. "I was thrown clear. When I woke up, they told me everyone else was gone." "And they told us the same about you," Philip replied. "By the time I found Bill years later, we'd both built new lives. The guilt, the confusion, it was easier to stay quiet. Until last week," Bill Chen added from his hospital bed. "When I saw Shaq on TV, it was like seeing young Philip again. Same heart, same spirit. I knew I had to find you both before." He gestured weakly at his hospital room. "The doctors gave Dad 3 days," David Chen explained. "He wasn't supposed to wake up at all. But this morning, when he did..." "That's why the hospital called the airport," Shaq realized. "Why they rushed us here." Mr. Henderson shook his head in amazement. "If you hadn't given up your seat, I would have missed my connection. I never would have made it in time." "Like father, like son," Bill Chen smiled. "Both of you, putting others first without knowing the whole story." Philip Harrison looked up at his son. "Remember when you were little, and you asked me why I always taught you to help others? This is why, son. Because one day, 50 years ago, James Henderson taught me the same thing. And today, without even knowing it, you completed the circle." A nurse appeared in the doorway again. "I really must insist Mr. Chen rest now." But Bill Chen had one more thing to say. "James," he called out, "the photograph. Look at the back." Mr. Henderson turned over. The worn photograph that had started everything. There, in faded ink, was a message he'd never seen before. "Helicopter Heroes, 1968. Brothers forever. Some bonds even death can't break." As they prepared to leave Bill Chen to rest, Shaq looked around the room at these men. His father, Mr. Henderson, Sergeant Chen. Their story had started 50 years ago in the jungles of Vietnam. It had survived miscommunication, survivor's guilt, and the passage of time. And somehow, through a simple act of kindness on a crowded plane, he had helped bring them back together. Outside the hospital room, Philip Harrison turned to his son. "You know, Tommy Martinez always said everything happens for a reason." Looks like he was right. Mr. Henderson smiled. "He would have loved this. Probably would have bet us $50 it would happen exactly this way." They all laughed, remembering the pilot who never made it home. 4 men had boarded a helicopter in Vietnam 50 years ago. 3 had survived to see this day. And now their story would live on, a testament to the power of courage, kindness, and the unexpected ways the past reaches out to touch the present. All because a basketball star gave up his seat to a veteran. All because sometimes the biggest acts of kindness have consequences we never could have imagined. And speaking of unexpected kindness, make sure to check out our next incredible story. Big Shaq gives his first-class seat to a struggling mother. What happens next is unbelievable. You won't believe how one NBA legend's compassion created a chain reaction that changed an entire community. Thank you for joining us for today's story. We'd love to hear about acts of kindness from your part of the world. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and share a moment when someone's generosity touched your life. Whether you're viewing from Sydney or Seattle, Bangkok or Boston, your stories inspire us all. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to catch more heartwarming stories of everyday heroes making the world a better place, one small act at a time. Until next time, remember, kindness is like a basketball. You never know how far it will bounce, but it always makes an impact.